What's up guys, this is VinylicPuma and today I'm back with another Fallout 4 video. However, instead of talking about regular Fallout 4, we're going to be talking about the state of Fallout 4 VR. As some of you may know, Fallout 4 VR came out in December 2017, and as you may have guessed from this video's title, it's been a while since Bethesda last updated this game. In fact, we're slowly coming up on 3 months since the last update, which according to Steam was on January 30th, 2018. I also find this case curious because it's not like Bethesda hasn't been updating their other titles. After all, regular Fallout 4 just got updates in both the beginning of March and April, while Doom 2016 was updated at the end of March. Granted, there have been long periods without updates for regular Fallout 4, however, these weren't quite as close to the game's launch like we're seeing with Fallout 4 VR. It's also not like Fallout 4 VR itself was a total failure. Granted, it didn't sell anywhere near as well as regular Fallout 4, but the game still has about 120,000 owners on Steam. And this is pretty good when you consider that most of the other highest-selling VR games on Steam, like Arizona Sunshine, Superhot VR, Job Simulator, Gorn, and even H3 VR, all have sold close to or well above 100,000 copies. Plus, it doesn't appear Bethesda is leaving the VR market, as Bethesda did just release Skyrim VR for the PC. While I would say it's a little too early to call the sales on the PC version of Skyrim VR, if you look at the VG chart sales of the PlayStation 4 version of Skyrim VR, it has sold about 660,000 copies, which is very impressive considering that, much like Fallout 4 VR, it's basically a AAA port to VR. With all of these things in mind, I find it somewhat baffling that Fallout 4 VR hasn't received any updates and has seemingly been ignored since the end of January, and I want to go over some reasons why I think this has happened. But before that, I think we should talk about why Bethesda should update Fallout 4 VR in the first place. While there have been some improvements to the game since it came out, most notably to how weapon scopes now work in Fallout 4 VR, I still feel the game needs a lot of work. Specifically, Fallout 4 needs its DLC content. Now, while Skyrim VR launched on PlayStation with both the vanilla game and all of its DLC intact, Fallout 4 VR launched with only its vanilla game, despite that it had been well over a year since Fallout 4's final DLC had been released. It should probably go without saying, but I think Bethesda should finally update the game to add support for these DLCs. In fact, I think Bethesda should make the DLCs free, considering that those that purchased Fallout 4 VR purchased it for $60. Given that the regular Fallout 4 Game of the Year edition also costs $60, I think that this is something that is reasonable to ask for. Ultimately, having Fallout 4 VR have all of the DLC that the base game has would make the game far more appealing, especially since some of Fallout 4's DLC added new quests, weapons, and armor that would no doubt enhance the experience. Something else that I think is worth mentioning is that Fallout 4 VR, unlike Bethesda's release of Skyrim VR on the PC, doesn't have any gamepad support. This means that you can't use an Xbox One or even a PS4 controller with the game, and you're pretty much stuck with using the HTC Vive's wand controllers. And while there's nothing necessarily wrong with the Vive controllers per se, you do have to admit that it's pretty weird that Bethesda didn't add controller support for Fallout 4 VR, where it does exist on both the PC and PSVR versions of Skyrim VR. Adding proper gamepad support would enhance the experience and would make the game far more enjoyable to play for some users. Plus, when you consider the fact that Bethesda has floated the idea of this update being added at some point in the future via news articles, I have to wonder why it's taken them so long to update the game and add this functionality. I think a final thing that Bethesda could do would be to look into and make a lot of the suggested .ini tweaks and various fixes that Steam users have managed to implement to help improve performance. That way, when someone purchases a VR headset and also purchases Fallout 4 VR, they aren't going to have to go through a myriad of fixes and also won't have to download a bunch of mods to make the game work properly. In other words, instead of purchasing the game and having to implement numerous fixes via third-party tools and comb through forums for potential fixes, as Todd Howard has famously proclaimed, Fallout 4 VR should, quote, just work. By taking time to fix the game and get it to run better without all of the mods or third-party tools and I fixes, I think the game will be far more enjoyable to play and would draw in the greater mod community from Fallout 4. Ultimately, though, those are just 3 things in particular that could be fixed to make the game far more enjoyable to play. Having gamepad supports, better fixes, and finally taking time to add all of the DLC would greatly enhance the experience. However, I'd now like to talk about why I think Fallout 4 VR hasn't been updated. The first major reason that I think we really haven't seen any major updates for Fallout 4 VR is due to the game's current HTC Vive exclusivity. It's safe to say that one of the reasons that Skyrim VR released on PC and has things like gamepad support as well as support for a variety of VR headsets like the Oculus Rift, HTC Vive, and even Windows mixed reality headsets is due to this lack of an exclusivity deal. It's possible that because Fallout 4 VR is currently a Vive exclusive, there could be provisions in the contract that prevent Bethesda from adding key features like gamepad support. After all, if you can just buy an Xbox One controller and play through the game that way, what's stopping you from buying any available VR headset and then playing through the game? By requiring the Vive wants to play, this would theoretically ensure that you would need an HTC Vive to play the game. Ironically, this hasn't stopped people from getting it to work with the Oculus Rift's touch controllers, but my guess is that adding official gamepad support would potentially remove Fallout 4 VR's semi-exclusive status. In this scenario, my guess is that Bethesda will update the game whenever Fallout 4 VR's exclusivity deal with HTC expires. Given that Skyrim VR was exclusive to PlayStation VR from mid-November 2017 up until early April 2018, I would guess that the next update for Fallout 4 VR could potentially be coming soon. Hypothetically speaking, if the HTC exclusivity deal was for about 6 months or so, we could see a new update for Fallout 4 VR as early as either May or even June 2018. Another reason I suspect that we haven't seen an update for Fallout 4 VR could be because Bethesda is currently working on a console version of the game. As I mentioned earlier, Skyrim VR sold over 660,000 copies, which is pretty impressive given that it's basically just a port of Skyrim Special Edition with a VR mode. Given that Fallout 4 VR sold about 120,000 units on PC in comparison, I would say that it's totally possible that Bethesda could be working on and trying to figure out a way to get Fallout 4 VR onto the PlayStation 4. I suspect that Fallout 4 VR on PC could greatly benefit from this, as the developers would definitely have to make a lot of changes and optimizations to get Fallout 4 VR to run on the PlayStation 4. However, given Skyrim VR's relative success on the PlayStation 4, I think it's fair to say that Bethesda is at least tempted to try and get Fallout 4 VR to work on the PlayStation 4. Especially given that the PlayStation VR's install base is about 2 million units, which is considerably more than both the Oculus Rift and HTC Vive combined. So I would say in this scenario, a new patch for Fallout 4 VR on PC wouldn't come out until the PlayStation VR version came out. And that could be until the end of this year, which I would say is just simply way too long to wait. This next possibility is the most grim, but I think it's potentially possible that Bethesda has lost faith in Fallout 4 VR entirely. If you take a look at the concurrent player counts for Fallout 4 VR on Steam compared to regular Fallout 4s, it's pretty obvious what people are playing. Granted, you don't need to have a $500 to $600 HTC Vive headset to play one of those games, but even still, you would think Fallout 4 VR's player counts would be a little bit higher. There's also a possibility that Fallout 4 VR's sales numbers simply just aren't high enough for them to continue working on the game. While 80,000 plus units is a lot for a VR title on Steam, there's a possibility that 120,000 plus units of Fallout 4 VR isn't enough for Bethesda to justify allocating resources to it. While Bethesda could only really answer this question for us, at the moment, it's frustrating for owners and prospective owners. After all, owners bought something that needs some fixes, while prospective owners are going to be skittish when it comes to buying Fallout 4 VR because of the current state that the game is in. In this scenario, the game never gets patched, and basically if you bought Fallout 4 VR, you're kinda out of luck. Ultimately, I think there will probably be another patch at some point, and my guess is that the next patch will come out whenever the HTC exclusivity deal ends, or whenever and if Fallout 4 VR ends up being released on console. Or maybe the worst case scenario occurs and Bethesda just abandons the game entirely. If we don't get any updates for any of Bethesda's VR titles in the coming months, I think the biggest predictor of another patch at that point is going to be revealed to us at Bethesda's E3 this year. If we don't see anything about Bethesda and VR at E3 this year, then I think it's safe to say that Fallout 4 VR will likely not be getting any more patches ever. Though, like I said, I think it's probably more likely that we're going to get a new patch for Fallout 4 VR than not. Otherwise, guys, I think that's going to pretty much wrap up this particular video. Feel free to leave a like on this video, and also let me know your thoughts about Fallout 4 VR or just VR in general. Otherwise, you could also just leave a comment with the word gubbin, which is apparently a British word for the term clutter, and I didn't know that, and I thought it was a pretty funny word. But again, guys, like this video if you liked it, click the bell to join the notification squad, and as always, take care, and I'll see y'all next time.